By the late 1880s, with the Native Americans on their reservations, it was becoming pretty obvious that the life for Indians was difficult and was unfair, and a reform movement began to grow. In this section of the lecture, we'll look at how the Indians were being abused and efforts at reform. In the 1880s, a growing number of people were starting to complain about how the Indians were being mistreated. The Women's National Indian Association, composed primarily of white middle class women, uh, that demanded better treatment. Soon, Eastern churches and liberals were forming Indian rights associations. Most notably, in 1881, Helen Hunt Jackson published a bestseller book entitled A Century of Dishonor, which highlighted the long history of broken treaties and unfair treatment by the whites against the Indians. This helped launch a reform movement that no longer saw Native Americans as savages, best removed through manifest destiny, but as victims whose mistreatment needed to be addressed. This reform movement spawned legislation proposed by Massachusetts Senator Henry Dawes. The Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 was intended to help Native Americans. It recognized that America's long history of excluding Indians had been unfair and decided, somewhat ethnocentrically, that the best remedy was now to include them into our society. If they were included, if they were made one of us, they could enjoy the same benefits as everyone else. The law therefore, quote, severed the Indians from their reservations. The U.S. no longer recognized individual Indian nations or reservations. In breaking up the reservations and ending all tribal recognitions, the Dawes Severalty Act intended to include the Indians and thus help them stop our long policy of exclusion. It provided that the reservations be divided up among the Indians. Each head of an Indian family would get either 160 acres for farming or 360 acres for grazing. Others could get smaller allotments. With all the Indian land disposed that way, there'd still be some additional Indian reservation land available, and this would be sold to whites, and the proceeds from these sales would go to help the Indians purchase farm tools and to get an education, to build Indian schools. To prevent unscrupulous whites from gaining control of the lands granted to individual Indians, the government would hold the property of each Indian in trust for 25 years, at which point they would become citizens. The problem was the grand scheme did not work. Because the land surveys took a long time, few allotments were made to Indians until the 1890s, and by that point the best lands had already been sold to the whites. Enforcement of the law's provisions was difficult, and while many people simply ignored the rules designed to help the Indians. Despite the 25-year prohibition, whites duped Indians into rip-off sales of their land. Money that should have gone to Indian schools often did not, and many Native Americans therefore were not properly assimilated. They simply could not often speak English or understand banking, money, railroads, or supply and demand, all the things you really needed to know to operate in a modern economy. Many Indians, of course, had come from a nomadic background and didn't even understand the concept of land ownership. In short, the Dawes Severalty Act left many Native Americans in poverty. By the 1930s, it was becoming obvious how bad the Dawes Severalty Act had been, and by this point, Native Americans had lost almost two-thirds of the land they had controlled before the law had passed. In what some called the Indian New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt got Congress to pass the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. This law repealed the Dawes Severalty Act and re-recognized Indian lands and nations. As the Dawes Severalty Act unfolded, the last major incident in Western Native American history took place in Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1890. The Sioux, who I'd mentioned earlier in the Battle of Little Bighorn, they'd been suffering in their assigned reservation as the Bureau of Indian Affairs often cut their meat rations and saddled them with more and more regulations, a product of the ill-advised implementation of the Dawes Act. Frustrated, the Sioux turned to the Indian prophet Wovoka, a Paiute Indian who had practiced the ghost dance. Wovoka claimed to have a prophetic vision during a solar eclipse on January 1st, 1889. The vision included the resurrection of the Indian dead and the removal of the whites. Wovoka taught that in order to bring about this vision to pass, the Native Americans must live righteously and perform traditional round dance known as the ghost dance in a series of 5-day gatherings. If they did so, Wovoka said, the vision would come to pass in the spring of 1891. The frustrated Sioux soon began to perform their own ghost dances. They believed that the ceremonial shirts worn during the ghost dances gave them special powers and that bullets could not penetrate them. Alarmed, the army was sent in to stop the dances, but when they tried to arrest Sitting Bull, a skirmish broke out, and Bull was shot in the head. When tempers flared, a number of Indians left the reservation and were rounded up by the army. On December 29, 1890, soldiers tried to disarm some of these Indians that had been rounded up at Wounded Knee Creek. At least some of the Indians didn't fully cooperate, and the result was that the soldiers opened fire. The first shots might have been an accident, as a soldier and Indian wrestled for control of a gun, which soon sparked a volley of fire. The Indian efforts to fight simply couldn't match the soldiers' Gatling guns. This saw a very early form of machine gun, and thus it really became a massacre, not a battle. Some of the Indians were shot in the back of the head as they tried to flee. In the end, 25 soldiers died, but 6 times that number of Indians died, and many of the dead were women and children. The Sioux claimed that one Indian who didn't surrender his weapon was deaf and simply didn't understand the order. In the years since, Wounded Knee has become to Native Americans the most important symbol of all the injustice whites had done to them over the years. In fact, one of the more famous Indian histories of the West was a book entitled Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by the author D. Brown. When Native American activists in the early 1970s wanted to call attention to the ongoing plight of Indians, they took over the small South Dakota town of Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee had assumed by that point a real importance as a symbol. This concludes the section on the plight of the Indians and the unfortunate attempt to help them.